Welcome to Dialogues at Fulcrum, where we have conversations with experts and analysts on the latest geopolitical, economic, and cultural developments in Southeast Asia.
Hello, and welcome to this Dialogues at Fulcrum podcast. Fulcrum is the opinion and commentary forum of the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute. I'm Lee Hwok Aun, a senior fellow with the Regional Economic Studies program at ISEAS and one of the Fulcrum editors. We are speaking on 12 August 2025, 5 days after the sweeping Trump tariffs took effect and 4 months after Liberation Day. It feels like 40 months since the shocking announcement of tariffs on 2nd April, during which Southeast Asia faced the specter of some of the most punishing treatment. The so-called reciprocal tariffs were paused for 90 days with a baseline 10% established. Then countries scrambled to the White House to make deals, revised rates were announced, and the deadline was extended. Eventually, President Trump's executive order of 31st July has fixed the terms of trade for now. But the situation is still fluid, with continual bilateral negotiations, sectoral rates, and the general, some would say even intentional, unpredictability of the Trump administration. Most of us, I'm sure, are craving clarity and insight, and for that, we're delighted to have Steve Olson. Steve is a visiting senior fellow at ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute and a non-resident fellow and visiting lecturer at the Yusof Institute of International Trade. He's also a member of the World Economic Forum Global Futures Council on Trade and co-leader of a joint work stream on geopolitics and trade. He began his career, a long and distinguished career, in Washington, D.C. as a U.S. trade negotiator. Thanks so much for joining us, Steve. How are you this morning?
I'm doing fine. It's my pleasure. Thank you very much for the invitation. We've certainly got no shortage of things to discuss.
Yeah, I know. We're going to dive straight into it, but I just wanted to say one more thing about Steve as a visiting fellow, too. He has produced 5 Fulcrum articles recently. That's available at fulcrum.sg at a rate of 1 a month since April. So that's a prolific rate and covering various aspects of the turmoil on global trade and specifically in the Southeast Asia context. And we appreciate that. Prolific writing, and some of our conversation will launch off of the articles, and some will be just the burning questions that we seek your perspective from your wealth of experience. I just want to start, I think, with a big picture question, and the prompting question is: has the U.S. driven the world economy to a pivotal and irreversible juncture? Some countries like Canada have been more forthright in saying that the U.S. is no longer a reliable trade partner, meaning this is a new normal, even beyond Trump. And I think this view is, of course, with Canada, unique circumstances, the immediate neighbor, with such a long alliance and friendship, that I think the sense of betrayal, I think, is a little bit more pronounced, and there are obviously many other circumstances there. But nonetheless, right, there is a lot of echoing of this view that this is a new order, and so just really appreciate your perspective. I think this view is informed by Trump's re-election. Despite Americans knowing his antagonisms towards China and NATO, right, and internationalism, you could say in general, and his love for tariffs. And then before that, Biden had implemented various US-centric and China-adverse policies like the CHIPS Act, technology curbs, that effectively block Chinese car exports, and so on. So I guess my question is, does Trump 2.0 differ, or how does it differ from Trump 1.0 and Biden? And has there been a decisive shift in the political establishment in the US? Whether in public mindsets in electoral swing states, that could sustain this sort of America First isolationist instincts and aggressive trade policies for some years to come.
Well, thanks very much. I think we're starting in exactly the right place. And from my point of view, there is no question that we've hit a historical inflection point here. Kind of take a deep breath, take a step back, and understand that with this new tariff regime the Trump administration has put in place, the U.S. has basically blown up the rules-based global trade system that's been in place for 8 decades. So instead of a system in which the countries of the world play the game of international trade by a mutually agreed set of rules and work to progressively reduce tariff and non-tariff barriers, we're in a world in which the U.S. is basically saying, look, trade rules don't matter, and we'll assess whatever rate of tariff we deem on appropriate on any country we feel like. That is a profoundly different world. In terms of how Trump 2.0 would differ from Trump 1.0, I think there's a real important point here. Um, I would say, at least for the first year and a half, maybe even 2 years of Trump's first term, he had the very good sense to be scared. I don't think he ever intended to be president. I don't think he ever particularly wanted to be president. And when he found himself winning the election, I think he was a little bit overwhelmed. And so he was much more likely to defer to sort of mainstream Republicans, the so called adults in the room that populated his first administration, that had a bit of a moderating effect on some of his more extreme tendencies. This time around, and then over the course of his administration, he concluded, I don't need these guys. I'm smarter than them anyway, and I'm just basically going to do what I want to do. So when he assumed office the second time around, the primary criteria for anyone in any type of a senior position in his administration was that they were fully on board with simply executing the marching orders that came from Donald Trump. So whether you agree with Trump's policies, whether you disagree with Trump's policies, I think we have to say the administration has been incredibly successful in executing that vision. And as I said, radically remaking the rules-based global trade system.
Yeah, what about the Biden and some of that continuity, and then again from Trump 1 to Biden, and then Trump 2.0? I think that there is a view internationally that there was, that continuity, and how much of it was Biden sort of being his hands tied versus, there is something that is sort of more America-wide. It sort of has a broader base in the political establishment. These policies certainly more, maybe clearly a more China-focused stance with Biden. But anyway, you have your comments on that?
I think it's a good point. There was, I think, a lot of people found that there was a surprising degree of of policy continuity between the Trump and Biden administrations, where the differences came in, I think, where Biden at least paid lip service to the need to work with allies, rebuild some of the fractured alliances, and at least nod in the direction of observing international and multilateral and norms from multilateral and international institutions. Trump, of course, views alliances and multilateral institutions as the problem. Now, I think where we've landed in the US political landscape in terms of this very different approach to trade that we've seen across Trump 1.0, Biden, and Trump 2.0 reflects the fact that there's been a real reassessment in the United States across the political spectrum about the wisdom of globalization and free trade policies. When I started my career in Washington as a trade negotiator in the 1980s, these principles were ascendant and they were unquestionable, almost like religious doctrines. Okay, this is how deeply they were embraced. And as the years went by and the decades went by, more and more people of every political persuasion, as well as mainstream American citizens, said, you know what? This promise of globalization, this promise of free trade, isn't working out as nicely and neatly as the elites told us it would. And it's not working out as nicely and neatly as the economic textbook suggested it would. So I think we've really fundamentally crossed a Rubicon in the United States in terms of attitudes towards international trade. And unfortunately, the message I've got to deliver is that any of the U.S. trade partners around the world that are hoping for a return to sort of the halcyon days of Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, this full-throated embrace of globalization and free trade, I don't think that's coming back to the United States.
Great. Thank you so much for that perspective, from the big picture and systemic view. Now, in your most recent Fulcrum article on 8th August, you wrote starkly, no one should assume that the conclusion of a handful of quote-unquote deals and the issuance of final tariffs is the end of the story. So while you talk about, there's something bigger than just Trump, but there is certainly a lot of Trump's imprint in the moment. And you wrote Trump regards trade policy as an ongoing reality show, and he knows that predictability is a ratings killer. So this is probably the first of a few questions asking you to, distill clear water from mud. But how do we understand this quote unquote deals? How do we differentiate reality from hyperbole?
I think we've really got to view these quote unquote deals through an entirely different lens and not our typical sort of trade negotiator, trade analyst lens. The first thing I would say is, I still sort of reflexively cringe when people refer to these things as trade agreements. I started my career on the U.S.-Canada free trade negotiations, which were the first major bilateral free trade negotiations ever, free trade agreement ever negotiated between two countries. And it was between two countries with remarkably complementary trading systems and economies. Those negotiations took a team of dozens and dozens and dozens of negotiators on each side working intensively for 2 years to conclude that agreement. So the idea now that we're going to dispatch the Commerce Secretary and the Treasury Secretary for 2 days of meetings in Sweden and or London or Geneva or whatever the case might be, and they're going to come back with a quote unquote trade agreement really belies the complexity of what an actual free trade agreement is. I see these agreements more as amorphous agreements that Trump can sort of present to the American public as these incredible victories. But we don't have any details on how these things will operate. We don't know really if they'll ever be concluded because they're just framework agreements that require a lot of subsequent negotiations. So all of these quote unquote deals, I think, are flimsy and potentially as ephemeral as the wind blowing by. If Trump decides tomorrow that he doesn't want to abide by any of these quote unquote deals, he won't.
Well, let me respond then, though. I think maybe one angle to this or a counterpoint is that, well, and I think that's reflected in the approach, which is a blanket tariff. And so maybe you can explain a bit, how is that unworkable? Is it because you cannot replace there are a very complex system, that has so many line items and different terms and different tariff rates, or is it going to be too disruptive for the existing contracts? Ultimately, it's just unworkable. Is that what you're saying? And can you expand on that?
There's a number of problems, both sort of practical from a commercial business point of view, as well as philosophical in terms of our global trade system. So, look, no system has ever been perfect, but our rules-based global trade system that we've been operating under for 80 years has been a primary driver of economic growth and development in every corner of the globe, and especially here in Southeast Asia. Now, the success of that system and the success that so many Southeast Asian countries had as a result of that system was built on the sanctity of fundamental principles, being predictability, stability. Everybody knows the rules. Everybody plays by a set of rules. There is something called most favored nation treatment in tariffs, which is everybody gets the same tariff rate. You don't say, well, this is Vietnam's rate, and this is Malaysia's rate, and this is Singapore's rate, and this is Brazil's rate, and this is India's rate. this approach to tariffs torpedoes that whole approach and really destroys that stability and predictability that so many countries in the region have based their remarkable economic development on. And then that's sort of the philosophical system-wide problems with this approach to tariffs. The practical problems for businesses, I don't know how anybody manages a supply chain. I mean, my heart really goes out to those executives that are responsible for managing corporate operations across extended global supply chains, because every night when you go to bed, you don't know if you're going to wake up tomorrow to find out that the tariff structure that you've based all of your corporate operations on has been completely thrown out the window. So that will have nothing other than a chilling effect on business and trade. So I think there's a variety of difficulties with this approach to trade.
Yeah, and speaking of unpredictability, and you brought up, corporations. There's another recent curveball about semiconductors. I think certainly of interest, particularly to Southeast Asia, where they have a huge contribution to exports and economies of up to 100%, unless they would invest in the US. I mean, is it actionable in the first place to tariff a corporation? And yeah, how much legs does this have, and where do you see this going?
It's interesting to note that when it comes to semiconductors, Trump and Biden have exactly the same objective. Biden and Trump both wanted to increase semiconductor production in the United States of America. Biden thought that the way that you do that would be by offering generous multi-billion dollar subsidies. Trump looks at that and says, that's for suckers. I also want production in the United States, but we're going to do it by forcing their hand by putting these astronomical tariffs in place unless these companies commit to substantial investment in the United States. Now, there's a couple of different problems with this. First and foremost, there's very real questions as to whether or not the United States is capable of supplying the skilled workforce that would be necessary to substantially increase semiconductor production in the United States. And we've seen some of the timelines that were initiated under the Biden administration already being slowed down for exactly that reason. The other thing that causes me to be fairly skeptical is one thing we can observe readily over the years, over the decades, is that politicians and business executives love to get together at a groundbreaking ceremony where they cut a ribbon and stick a couple shovels in the ground and talk about the commitment of a particular country to invest X, hundreds of millions of dollars that are going to employ, thousands and thousands of workers, and everybody is happy and it's a great success and everybody goes away. Well, sort of the ugly secret is, in a lot of instances, it just never materializes for one reason or another. Those big celebrated investments, those plants that were supposed to be built, once the cameras get shut off, once the press interest wanes, once a certain amount of time goes by, once different politicians are perhaps no longer in office, all of a sudden you read a small article in the back of the newspaper saying that the company's actually decided, no, we're not going to do that plant in Arizona. We're going to put it in Malaysia after all. So I'm very dubious about these massive pledges of investment. And there's also fudging of the numbers. How much of that actually is new investment? How much of that is investment that was already planned, already booked years ago? So I think there's a number of problems with this approach, and I think the United States is still very far away from being able to get a vibrant semiconductor manufacturing industry up and running in the United States.
Yeah, so then there's another issue that of acute interest in the region, the transshipment tariff. And Trump's July 31st executive order reiterated the 40% transshipment tariff. I think it first came to prominence in the US, Vietnam. Okay, I won't, well, forgive me for using the word deal, but it's a short word. I think people understand that with caveats. Now, this will
Yeah.
tariff will apply across the board and really could affect Southeast Asia. Now, a week before that executive order, you wrote on July 23rd in Fulcrum, the details remain murky. Based on past experience, the Trump administration is unlikely to be completely satisfied with efforts to curtail transshipments, and reinstatement of tariffs for non-compliance will hang overhead like the sword of Damocles. So now that we're in the enforcement phase, how do you see the transshipment problem unfolding?
Well, I think it's going to be a big muddled mess. In short, for provisions like this, the devil always lies in the details, and we simply don't have the details. Starting with the most basic point, what does the United States mean when it says transshipment? If it is referring to illegal transshipments by which customs documentation is fraudulently altered, so a product of China enters Vietnam, the documentation is fraudulently altered to convert to say that it's a product of Vietnam, and then it's exported to the US to take advantage of a lower tariff. Well, that's fraud. That's against the law, and the people who are caught should be facing very severe criminal penalties for doing that. So, if the intent is to crack down on that, I think any person who believes in the rule of law would support that and would think it's a good idea. If, on the other hand, transshipment is intended to target what we would consider to be legal transshipment, an input or a raw material enters one country, then is either sufficiently processed or incorporated into a much larger product so that under existing rules of origin, it is now considered to be, legitimately so, a product of Vietnam, to go back to our earlier example, then there should be no problem with that. There should be no problem with that. That is an ordinary, recognized practice under the rules of international trade. There are very few products that are made entirely 100% in one country. So, how is this going to work? Are there going to be incredibly complicated rules of origin that will attempt to identify Chinese inputs and assess a separate tariff rate on them? I mean, that would be painstaking and almost impossible to implement. So, my expectation is that one way or the other, this probably isn't going to work out great. This probably isn't going to be smoothly and effectively implemented and meet the objectives of the United States. So I think at some point, we have the very real possibility that the U.S. will be complaining that we haven't sufficiently cracked down on transshipment, and we'll be back in a ballpark where reinstatement of tariffs, as I said, will hang over the head of these countries like the sword of Damocles.
Yeah, and I think you're bringing up how, yeah, it's really another aspect to have to monitor and enforce, and don't know about the capacity and even the terms for
Yeah,
that. Yeah.
exactly.
Let's dive a little deeper into the tariffs that now are enforced. And just for context, right, after the announcement on 2nd April, there was a revision on 7th of July, and then it went up for some, it went down for others. It would take 5 minutes just to plot out each country's tariff trajectory. And then, of course, what's really matters now is 31st July with the schedule of tariffs. Some are based on bilateral agreement, and then some were unilaterally declared by the White House. So they have been enforced since 7th of August, with Indonesia, Thailand, Philippines, Malaysia, and Cambodia at 19%, Vietnam 20%, Brunei 25%, Myanmar and Laos at 40%, and Singapore at the baseline 10%. So, how did countries end up with these tariff rates?
I'll be honest. I think if you put a gun to the head of the Commerce Secretary or the Treasury Secretary, I don't think they could explain to you how those tariff rates were arrived at. It was an extremely arbitrary process, and in stark contrast, I would say, to how investigations and punitive tariffs typically unfold in the United States. I worked at the Commerce Department, and the Commerce Department was responsible for anti-dumping and countervailing duties. And the duty rates that were arrived at under that process were the result of painstaking technical investigations, weighing what's the commercial harm, what's the exact impact of the subsidies. Should it be a tariff rate of 17.5 or a tariff rate of 18.2? These were defensible methodologies that were used to arrive at what those tariff rates would be. Why does one country get 20%, another country, neighboring country, gets 19%? There is no discernible logic or rationale or methodology. There's just a high degree of arbitrariness.
So, based on what you have seen, with how I think countries have engaged with the US a bit differently, what can countries learn about negotiating with the US? Not that there is sort of one magic formula that we can prescribe, but what are some of the ways to actually try to mitigate the loss, or just arrive at something, that compromise, that is amenable.
I think you've got to wrap your head around that a chaotic trade environment and unpredictability is going to be the day to day reality for as long as Trump remains in the White House. And on any given day, an issue can arise, something can come out of left field, and the playing field, which you might have thought had reasonably settled down, had been thrown into turmoil again. Now, that's exceedingly difficult to deal with, but in my judgment, that's the reality. Again, I don't view Trump through the lens of a typical trade negotiator. I view Trump as the director of a reality television program. And he always wants to keep the episodes unpredictable and exciting. And he always wants to keep us tuning in next week to see what's going to happen in the next week's episode. So, my advice to the trade partners of the United States is don't get comfortable. This is not going to settle down, and insulate yourself as well as you are able from the chaos and unpredictability that I think will be with us for the duration of the Trump administration.
I still see that there could be some patterns. I mean, we see that there is a bit of a convergence around 19 to 20%. And I think for some countries, there was a basis for them to say that, look, keep it at least the same. And I think Malaysia's tried to establish more of the rapport. There's this curious nomination for the Nobel Peace Prize for Trump by Cambodia. And I think, this ties in. I mean, none of this can be very conclusive, but on the other hand, there's the Brazil action, and then India as well, for very overt political reasons, but more on trying to up the ante on these countries. My concern, or I think one of the concerns in the region, though, is that whether the countries that don't have have less resources to actually negotiate, Myanmar and Laos, right, and they face a devastating 40%. So I guess, I mean, what can they do at this point, and how do you see, what's the outlook for Myanmar and Laos?
I don't think the outlook is particularly good. Unfortunately, I don't think Trump's approach to negotiation comes from his background as a New York real estate developer, and that's all about hard knuckle tariffs and leverage. And to the extent that neither of these countries particularly has any leverage that they could exert over the United States, I don't think that there's tremendously bright prospects for a significant improvement. Having said that, of course, unpredictability is Trump's hallmark, but I wouldn't hold out tremendous hope that either of those countries will be able to substantially get out from under those rates.
Well, thank you. I mean, on that sobering note, maybe we can move on to some other implications. Not that we're moving on to something necessarily brighter topic, but I think there is a lot of discussion. I mean, by force of necessity, confronted with the realities now about what happens with trade, with the trade oriented or export oriented model, and you have also written about that. Could you expand on that a little bit? How does its impact, especially on Southeast Asia, for what happens within and these Southeast Asian countries, and they all have been in this export-oriented mode, but also beyond. Whether the what are the implications on the competition with countries like Mexico, other export powerhouses.
Yeah, I think it is human nature that we sometimes only miss things when they're gone, and after they're missing, we look back and reflect and say, "Wow, that was really great that we had that, and we really miss it now." I think that's going to be our experience with the rules-based global trade system. I think the remarkable benefit that, in particular, the small trade dependent economies of Southeast Asia and in other regions of the world experienced as a result of that system, I think will really come into stark contrast as that system continues to collapse. I think it's going to be much, much more difficult for countries to pursue that export led development model in a world where tariffs can be raised arbitrarily. Tariffs can change from tweet to tweet or social media post to social media post. And the largest consumer market and the largest importer in the world, the United States, is openly hostile to trade rules. We one of the great success stories of our rules based global trade system was that we moved away from law of the jungle and we moved away from might makes right. So in the halcyon days of the WTO, a country like Thailand could challenge the United States, a trade practice of the United States, say this is discriminatory, win a WTO case, and have the and have the United States drop that trade practice. We are so far now from that world. And I think the consequences and the downsides of that are going to become increasingly evident. And I think we're now that it's cracking up, I think we're going to miss having that rules-based global trade system more than ever.
So let's go back to the US domestic context for a little bit. And I think we can be maybe just the second last topic and we pan out again into the global
Mhm.
context. But to the US, and I'm invoking this adage all politics is local. There will be inevitably some sort of pressures that will be faced and midterm elections. So, but question is, which constituencies do you think could have a tempering effect? Um, Not expecting at all any reversal, but some tempering effect on President Trump from the MAGA base, Wall Street, or Main Street, right? Especially with inflation and if the jobs don't show up. What are your thoughts on that?
If there is one thing that I would point to that might have some moderating influence on Trump, I do think it's the financial markets. So, a few when executives come in and rationally try to explain how damaging the tariffs are, he has a propensity to kind of dismiss them as whining and they'll get over it. Now, that seems to be his attitude to a lot of the representations that corporate executives make to him. Now, if we were to see a steep and a prolonged decline in financial markets that were obviously associated with his trade policies, bond market sell-offs, things like that. I think that's probably the best. I think that's potentially the one guardrail that could rein him in at least somewhat.
And there's also this constitutional challenge on the president's authority to declare an emergency and pursue these tariffs by executive order and bypassing
Yeah.
Congress. What, if anything, could you shed light on that?
My personal view on this is it's really a non-issue. If these tariffs get shot down under IEPA, the Emergency Economic Powers Act, Congress has devolved enough authority to the executive branch over the decades that they'll just take different routes to the same destination. Now, the reason that they used IEPA was because it was cleanest, most simplest, and most direct. And if they have to use other mechanisms, Section 301, Section 232, the various jumble of trade authorities in the United States, they'll still be able to largely maintain the tariff regime that they put in place. It'll just be more cumbersome, it'll be more difficult, it'll be more awkward. But in my judgment, a court ruling is not going to undo this new tariff regime that the Trump administration has put in place.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely difficult to see the administration being deterred, and even if it does as well, it's probably going to go. It's just going to escalate and be a protracted battle with winding its way through the courts. So, I think for the last question, I mean, this has been very stimulating, but just one eventually also, all good things come to a close, and I think we can end with a very big question, and do take your time to unpack this, but it's about the this playing out right in the shadow of U.S. China superpower rivalry. They have yet to reach a bilateral resolution, and in fact, as we speak. There was just an announcement of another 90-day extension for them to arrive at, let's just say, resolution, some agreement. Many countries, though, are caught in this crossfire, and China has sought to defend, on the one hand, the global trade order. It's projecting itself as a friendly and more reliable trade and investment partner, but it has also threatened to take action against third countries whose deals with the U.S. marginalize China. How do you see China's role in the world economy, and what are the consequences for Southeast Asia?
Well, you're right. It certainly is a big question, and something we're all going to have to watch very closely over the years to come to see how it unfolds. Here's what I would say. I think the conduct of the Trump administration, in a lot of respects, has been a huge gift and a huge opportunity to China, because in this ongoing geopolitical rivalry, with each side sort of trying to court the favor of many of these countries caught in the middle, the conduct of the United States could have a tendency to nudge countries to tilt in the direction of China. But the caveat that I would introduce is that just because the United States has shot itself in the foot doesn't mean that necessarily all of that will accrue to the benefit of China. Because keep in mind, there are a fair number of issues and a fair number of complications and a fair number of difficulties between China and other countries, particularly in the region, particularly in Southeast Asia. So it's one thing for senior Chinese officials to show up at Davos and other prominent regional or international conferences and attempt to position themselves as the defender of the rules-based order and a reliable and a mutually beneficial trade partner. I think China has seized the rhetorical mantle in trying to position itself in those terms. But from the perspective of a lot of countries in the region, the rhetoric hasn't always matched the reality. And the fact of the matter is, whether it's convenient or not for some of these countries to acknowledge, a lot of countries in the region have similar complaints about China as the Trump administration or the Biden administration or the Obama administration had about China as well. And this issue of overcapacity, I think, is not going to disappear. And in particular, if access to the US market remains constrained, and China continues to have excess industrial capacity, they're not going to take all those products and dig a hole in the backyard and put them into the ground. Those products are going to find their way into international markets, and those international markets could be Indonesia and Malaysia and elsewhere in the region. And so I think you're going to see ongoing trade tensions between some of these countries that have legitimate concerns that domestic manufacturing industries could be wiped out by these low-cost Chinese products. And a lot of countries have or will take anti-dumping measures against China that will displease China. And we've seen again and again when China has been displeased, it has no hesitancy in taking strong remedial actions against those countries. So, whereas the conduct of the United States has been a big gift to China and provided an opening for China, by the same token, it's not all hugs and kisses between China and a lot of these other countries in the region. And that's before we even get into some of the very significant territorial disputes between China and other countries in the region, particularly in Southeast Asia. So the United States has provided China with a tremendous opening here, but really it remains to be seen how effectively China will be able to capitalize on that.
Yeah, thanks so much. And I think, those closing lines, really encapsulate an overarching theme of this conversation. There's so much still in flux and it remains to be seen. But thank you so much, Steve. We're speaking to Steve Olson. You've given some pointed and more conclusive answers on subjects. I think where the evidence does point to does allow for that and point to us to a more firm stance on certain matters and a clearer interpretation. But then there's still so much that is unfolding in this whirlwind and the ongoing uncertainties and turmoil. But you've given us pointers and I think the guideposts on how we can think through what's going on. And so thank you very much. And to all our listeners as well, thank you for tuning in. And don't forget, there's fulcrum.sg, lots of articles there, including those by Steve.
My pleasure. Thank you so much. Happy to join you anytime.
Thank you for joining us in our conversation on Dialogues at Fulcrum. If you want to access more of our analysis on Southeast Asia, please check out fulcrum.sg. Dialogues at Fulcrum is brought to you by the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute. We look forward to sharing more insightful conversations with you in subsequent episodes. See you then!